Hi, welcome to the Right Review. I'm Nola Nash, and we are here with Liza Nash Taylor. And Liza, it's so good to have you on the Right Review. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're looking forward to learning about the evolution of women's fashion. This is pretty exciting stuff, and I cannot wait to hear what you've got to share with us today. And folks out there, if you're watching live or you're watching in the replays, go ahead and drop your comments into the comment section. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat while Liza is presenting. And that way at the end, hopefully we can get to some of your questions for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So Liza, I'm going to turn things over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Nola. And thanks to Annie McDonnell, who isn't with us, but thank you, Annie, for setting this up. Thank you, Nola, for hosting and making a time slot for me to give my little fashion talk. I am a novelist, a historical novelist. I am not a fashion historian by trade, although I did work in fashion design for Ralph Lauren in an earlier career. And I originally developed this talk for the North American Historical Novel Society Conference in 2019 in Washington, D.C. And the theme of that conference was revolution. So I developed Evolution and Revolution, a talk on women's fashion history. And I just kept finding things that that interested me. So I put together this PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you here. Now, over the next 52 minutes or so, I'm going to show you some beautiful garments, and we're going to cover a wide swath time-wise, although there's a lot, of course, that I don't have time to cover. So pre-COVID, when we all wore, actual clothes, I have on yoga pants right now on the bottom, but with the help of a leather biker jacket or shredded jeans or boss lady pants, a woman or anyone could channel an identity through our choices in clothing. And what we wear can inspire confidence. It can help us blend into the background. And each of the items in our wardrobe arguably has a history, from blue jeans to brassieres. And what we wear, or what we choose not to wear, conveys, in effect, the history of where women have been and what they fought to change. So we'll have time for questions at the end, as Nola said, or stick them into the chat. I'm going to start a screen share. And once I start that, I can't see really your questions yet, but hold them till the end or put them in the chat. So on my website, lizanashtaylor.com, there's a tab for this talk, and it has a list of historical novels that go along with or inspired by some of the designers I'm going to talk about, or some of the time periods I'm going to talk about. So if you look at that book list, there are some good novels and also a lot of the research books that I used. All right, now, fingers crossed, I'm going to go to screen share. Nola, are you seeing it?
I'm seeing it.
Yay!
There we go.
Okay, good.
I'm going to put you full screen, though, so they can see this up close, okay? Because now we're both in the corner, so I'm going to put you full screen. Here we go.
Yeah, so if you're watching,
I'm back and back up.
Yeah, if you're watching, you're going to see more details if you're full screen, too. So I chose to begin this talk in the year 1850 because of one particular garment. And before I tell you more, I have to back up a little bit, and we're going to start with an invention. In the 1830s and 40s, bicycles were starting to be mass produced, and they were wildly popular. So women saw men tooling around on bicycles, and they wanted to get in on the fun. So we can see in the shot on the left that gal in the seat would so much rather be pedaling and steering, right? So women cyclists at this time were lampooned, as we see in the cartoon there. The caption translates from the French, "Yoo-hoo, everybody, close your peepers." And at this time, bicycling for ladies, much like women's suffrage, which was also going on, was considered controversial. Moral guardians proclaimed the bicycle is the devil's advocate agent morally and physically. Now, women's hoops and corsets and bustles, which were everyday wear for most of the female population, they were voluminous, and they had horsehair hemmed skirts with multiple layers and petticoats, and they were constricting, and they were an impediment to bicycling, not to mention dangerous. So by enabling women to control their own transportation needs, the bicycle offered an autonomy that had previously been out of reach. And riding a bicycle shattered norms of appropriate conduct for women, and it ushered in a new era of women asserting control over their bodies and their behavior. For reasons of health and freedom of movement, more progressive women began to instigate dress reform. In 1851, Elizabeth Smith Miller of Geneva, New York, debuted a radical new look. It was a knee-length skirt with full Turkish-style pantaloons that were gathered at the ankle. And the garment I'm speaking of, we now know of as bloomers. But bloomers were not invented by Amelia Bloomer. She popularized them through her trailblazing newspaper for women called The Lily. And Amelia wrote articles calling for changes in dress that would be less restrictive and make personal adornment of secondary importance. So bloomers were revolutionary because the idea of women having the same freedom of movement as men was scandalous. The Lily urged women to shed their heavy, bulky hoop skirts in favor of the new healthful style because they weren't constricted by these corsets and everything. Bloomers made it easier for their wearers to get through doorways, to get onto carriages and trains unassisted, as well as making it easier for a woman to dress herself. You can see here, it takes like a village to get this gal's skirt on. The bloomer costume became a tangible symbol in the advancement of women's rights and infamous amongst the movement's critics. At the first National Convention for Women's Rights in 1850, women's suffrage was proposed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And one of the speakers was Lucy Stone. She was an orator and an abolitionist and an early champion of women's rights. And Lucy made headlines, as you can see, not for what she said, but for what she wore. The press was so negative, in fact, that Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists discarded the bloomer style after they realized that they were getting more attention for their dress than for their message. So at the turn of the century, suffragists were encouraged, both in the United States and in Britain, to dress traditionally in order to avoid accusations of eccentricity or spinsterish masculinity. It was a sort of a spoonful of sugar mentality. They realized that their best chance of winning the vote was to align themselves, at least outwardly, with Victorian and Edwardian ideals of femininity, even if they were engaging in seditious acts under the radar. Now, the alignment with this cause, for the most part, was shown by adorning white dresses with sashes or with jewelry in the suffrage colors, which were in Britain, green, white, and violet. In the United States, gold, white, and violet, standing for Give Women the Vote. Now, this showed unity, and it was a code that was instantly recognizable to fellow sympathizers, and it was a quiet statement to those who didn't back the cause. So here is some suffrage jewelry. Here's a banner. Obviously, a woman would wear it in a march or whatnot. And on the left, there's a portrait of the English suffragist, Evelyn Pankhurst. You see there's a hunger strike ribbon and a jail door, if you've been put in jail for protesting. Now, at the height of the suffrage campaign, between 1890 and 1900, the number of bicycle manufacturing firms in America rose from 27 to 312, with a corresponding growth in the production of accessories, including clothing. So the bloomer style was adapted from fashion bloomers, which you saw first, into athletic bloomers or knickerbockers. But women were still being lampooned. The cartoon, the black and white cartoon, says, "The mob objects to the lady cyclist wearing socks." So even so, there was no keeping women off their bikes. And here's what we could probably call the first sports bra from 1890. Can you imagine lacing yourself into that to take a bike ride today? I don't think so. Susan B. Anthony once said of the bicycle, "I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance." Anthony described the image of a woman on a bicycle as the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood. Now, at the same time, the manufacture and design of bicycles was affecting women's fashion. Another machine was being refined and patented. We're in the Industrial Revolution here, right? The Singer sewing machine, designed for home use, debuted at a time when the average annual American income totaled $500. Isaac Singer's sewing machines were selling for $125, and they were selling like hotcakes. And by the time Singer died in 1875, his company was turning a profit of $22 million a year. Now, the way that we now fear that robots will replace, and drones or whatever will replace human jobs, tailors and garment workers in the 19th century worried about the sewing machine. And in France, one early inventor of a sewing machine opened one of the first garment factories in the 1830s. And it was burned to the ground with him inside by a mob of 200 ticked off tailors. And the owner survived. The sewing machine made production more exact. It made it faster and cheaper. And in the 1880s, it was electrified. And so leading up to the turn of the century, we start to see a whole lot more ruffles and gathers in women's dresses. And at the same time, another invention, this one an accident, had a huge and lasting impact on fashion. And that was aniline dyes or synthetic dyes. An 18-year-old aspiring chemist from England named William Henry Perkin was working on a cure for malaria in his lab. And he noticed that the chemical sludge left from his experiments turned his fingers brilliant purple. So William, smart dude, switched directions and went into the chemical dye business. Heretofore, dyes could only be produced from natural sources, and they were expensive. So now, through chemicals, what we now think of as garishly Victorian colors, like in the needlepoint there, they were first available. And they were, everybody wanted their houses decorated in these colors. They wanted to wear these colors. And Perkins's Movine, this purple, was the first one of these. Now, another seemingly insignificant invention had a large effect on women's fashion. And this has to do with the corset. Here you see on the left, the 18th century corset. They used steel and bone stiffeners called busks that were slipped down into a channel that was sewn. And in the 18th century, the look was that cone-like shape with the boobs pushing up at the top. And then moving into the 19th century, the empire look, which we think of when we think of Jane Austen era, that became popular. And then by the mid-19th century, the hourglass silhouette, as defined by corsets, became very popular. That's the red corset you see. The look was achieved through the innovation of eyelets, those tiny, strong metal rings. They're on our Converse sneakers. And they ran them, obviously, as you can see, down the lacings of the corset. On the left, that is a maternity corset, gack. So what happened was, once they put these rings in, they could pull it tighter and tighter, and it wouldn't tear through the fabric. So here's a cartoon from 1830 of a woman being laced into her corset. So the term straight-laced, which we've all heard, meant that the laces of a corset were pulled so tight that they came together in a straight line, and they forced the back up, and they made it a little hard to breathe. Conversely, to be called a loose woman meant that your corset wasn't tied that tightly, allowing for easier removal or breathing, heavy or otherwise. And at this time, the sale of smelling salts did very well, because everybody got faint from having the breath literally squeezed out of them. So in the 1850s, wasp waists and an exaggeratedly feminine silhouette were the look. And through the rest of the 19th century, corsets remained popular, with variations in bustles and hoops and trimmings and sleeves. And by the turn of the century, the corseted look was exemplified by an actress named Camille Clifford, and also immortalized by the artist Charles Dana Gibson's Gibson Girl. So Camille Clifford, you can see she was quite a curvy gal, and this whole look was promoted through the growing popularity of photography at the time. And there was some early photoshopping going on in the late 1800s, as you can see. On the right, you see that little white patch on the back of the girl's waist there. So despite the restrictions of the corset, women, especially in the middle class, began to have more social freedoms. Women friends could travel together abroad, albeit with chaperones, as was portrayed in the beautiful 1986 movie A Room with a View, from the E.M. Forster story from 1908. I just started watching on Masterpiece Theater. There's a newer version of this as a mini series. I don't think it's as good as this movie. But women at this time, they began to wear more separates, blouses and skirts and jackets, and we began to see something of a menswear inspired look, with women wearing stiff collars like men and little neckties even. So now I'm going to switch over and tell you about some of the designers who've influenced and defined fashion since 1850. Before the 1860s and the use of sewing machines, men went to tailors and women went to dressmakers. There were no fashion shows. There were no seasonal collections as we know them. Nowadays, when we think of fashion designers, dozens of names come to mind. But in the 1860s, there was only one rock star in the fashion world. His name was Charles Frederick Worth. He was born in London in 1825, and he taught himself about fashion and garment construction by studying 18th century portraits of royals in the museums of London. He worked as an apprentice to textile merchants, and he had a break selling some early designs to an English noblewoman. And at the age of 20, he took off for Paris. He worked for a French designer, and his dresses started to really be noticed, and his designs caught the eye of European royalty. And in 1860, Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon III, appointed Worth her court couturier. And she's pictured here in this beautiful portrait in a Worth gown, along with Empress Elizabeth, the wife of Franz Joseph of Austria, also wearing Worth. Now, in 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball. We're back in the United States, in New York. It was estimated to cost $250,000. And in today's dollars, that's nearly $6 million for a party. Must have been quite the shindig. So Worth made Alva's costume for her, and it was called The Spirit of Electricity. And if any of you have read Therese Ann Fowler's book, A Well-Behaved Woman, The Story of the Vanderbilts, you'll know about this party and this dress. So Worth was, back in Paris, the first designer to use live models to show a seasonal collection to clients. And he was also the first to sew a branded label into his clothes, making a Worth dress a prestigious item to have among society women. And women came to his atelier for fittings and showings, and his salon became a society meeting point. And instead of having women come to him and say, oh, I saw a dress in a magazine, or I want a dress like so-and-so's, he designed a collection and he proclaimed, this is what's in fashion this season. He pioneered the concept of mixing and matching skirt bodices. So items could do, double duty, low cut top for night, higher cut top for day, same skirt. He developed interchangeable pattern pieces. And together with the electric sewing machine, this really revolutionized production methods. Worth is considered by many fashion historians to be the father of haute couture, which translates literally into high sewing. But it was Worth's eye for design that made him the first fashion dictator in the late Victorian era and moving into the Belle Epoque. And in this last slide, you can see between 1916 and 1926, over this 10-year span, within this one fashion house, the House of Worth, you can see how the silhouette evolved from Edwardian to what we think of as the flapper style with no waist. And I like just being able to see the little gradual way it evolved there over a 10-year period. So by the end of Charles Worth's career, his house employed 1,200 people, and his sons would continue the business, increasing the impact of the House of Worth on women's fashion. Now, to jump back for a minute to our starting point. After Japan opened up Western trade in 1850, there was a steadily increasing amount of Eastern influence in all areas of Western art and design. And later, in a similar way, Africa would have a big influence in the 1920s. So in the 19-teens, this Asian influence can be seen most notably in the designs of Paul Poivre, another Parisian designer. Poivre began his career working for other designers, as Worth did, including the son of Charles Frederick Worth. But they had opposing design aesthetics, and that led Poivre to open his own house in Paris in 1903. The first thing he did was to eliminate petticoats and bustles. And the second was to eliminate the corset in 1906. And this was huge. Poivre effected a real revolution in dressmaking and fashion. Because he didn't know how to sew, his design shifted the emphasis away from the skills of tailoring and pattern making to those based on draping, which is hanging fabric sculpturally off of the natural form, instead of using patterns to construct a covering for the artificial frame of the corset and the bustle. And you can see here how sculptural his designs are. So leading up to World War I in the 1910s and teens, Poiret's star rose until he declared himself the king of fashion. And he was one of the first designers to really challenge the silhouettes of the Victorian and Edwardian eras and to work in collaboration with artists. Most notably, he worked with Raoul Dufy, as we see in this 1911 coat. Dufy designed the fabric and Poiret made a coat out of it. Poiret was also the first designer to advertise using photography. I mean, we take all this for granted now, but back then it was a big deal. So keeping up with his ex-employer, the House of Worth, Poiret jumped on the bandwagon of the celebrity designer. He threw lavish costume balls at his house with costumes like this one, which shows his imaginative design aesthetic. I think you'd have a really good time at a party in that one, personally. So when World War I came along, Poivre left his business to serve France as an army tailor. And when he returned, he found that post-war fashion wasn't as fantastical and elaborate. It was more practical, and he couldn't adapt. So over the next 15 years, his groundbreaking designs would be entirely forgotten. His wife would divorce him, and his couture house would close. The leftover stock was sold by the pound as rags. The Association of Haute Couture discussed giving him a monthly allowance, but the idea was vetoed by his former employer, the House of Worth. Now there is a novel plot for you, right? So backing up a bit to 1914. Now that the corset has been eliminated, what are women supposed to wear under their clothes? Well, in 1913, a 19-year-old debutante named Mary Phelps Jacobs was getting dressed for a ball. She was upset that her corset ruined the line of her sleek evening gown, and she needed something, so she took 2 handkerchiefs and some ribbon, and she and her maid whipped this up. Pretty smart. The next year, she got a patent for the design, and Mary would later marry and live in Paris, and her husband would change her name. Caress, as she was now called, and Harry Crosby would become the most notoriously decadent couple in Jazz Age Paris, with a wild life of swinging sex and drugs and parties, but that is for another lecture. Caress was also an author and a publisher in her own right. Now, the main competition for the House of Worth and for Paul Poivre, both houses led by men, came from a British woman. In order to support herself and her daughter after the end of her first marriage, Lucy Duff Gordon began working as a dressmaker from home. In 1893, she opened Maison Lucile in London. And over the next 20 years, Lucile would become the first premier couture house with international branches in Paris, London, New York, and Chicago. Lucy was one of the first to offer seasonal shows. She called them mannequin parades, and they were a well-orchestrated who's who in New York and the cities where she had ateliers. You can see here is an invitation to one of them. Now, Lucy remarried to a Scottish nobleman, but she stayed in business, and her dresses, as you can see, were supremely feminine. Lucile believed that if dresses were to give any pleasure to their wearer, they must become part of the personality. So she named each of her designs using inspirations from literature and popular culture, and she called her collections her emotional gowns. In the middle is a tea gown, and she called that one the happiness dress. And that, to me, I mean, it has all the bells and whistles. It has lace, ruching, insertion, net, silk, ribbons, flowers. I mean, it looks to me like there should be little cartoon bluebirds flying around that dress and tying all those little bows and stuff. So the Lucile look was rendered in chiffon and lace and silk and delicate color combinations with exquisite details, as you can see here. She was one of the first designers to woo the press to come and see and write about her collections. And she wrote a monthly column for Harper's Bazaar and for Good Housekeeping. In the 1910s, Lucy Duff Gordon was all that. She dressed Irene Castle and Mary Pickford and her own equally glamorous sister, Eleanor Glynn, who was an actress and a romantic novelist of some notoriety. She wrote a book called It, basically about sexual attraction, and it became a movie with Clara Bow, and Clara Bow was then called the first It Girl, and that all came from this Eleanor Glynn novel. So Lucile's career, though, was fraught with controversy. In 1912, when the Titanic sank, Lucy and her family were on board, and there was a lawsuit questioning how the Duff Gordons, the Lord included, managed to be on the last lifeboat to leave the ship with only 12 people when it held 40. So after the Titanic controversy, there was a trial. She was cleared, but her reputation declined further when another lawsuit later accused her of taking credit for the designs of her assistants. And fans of Downton Abbey might remember that Lucille was the designer of Lady Edith's first wedding dress in season 3. And the gown was designed around an original Lucille train that the costume designer Caroline McCall found. And then she made the dress with repeated motifs that matched. So pretty. So another rising player I haven't talked about yet on the scene in Paris post-World War I and moving forward is a name we all know, Coco Chanel. No other designer has had such a lasting impact on fashion. Now, Poivre helped her get established when she was starting out in Paris, but Chanel seemed to have no problem at all leaving him in the dust when he went away to the war. Over her long career, Chanel defined the notion of staples that would last a lifetime. The little black dress, the tweed jacket, the feminine suit. But it was a type of fabric that would put her on the map. So I talked about sewing machine technology, right? It was progressing, and so was textile manufacturing technology at the same time. Chanel was the first to use wool jersey for something other than underwear or swimwear. And her concept, which was quite revolutionary, was that fashion should be available to all, that dresses should have multiple uses, and sportswear could be stylish as well as utilitarian. So her boxy, shorter, easier to move in pieces that we kind of think of when we think of Chanel, they freed women from corsets and also from a design Poivre had done, which was a hobbled skirt, which was gathered around the knees. In 1926, Vogue magazine first introduced what we now think of as a little black dress. I would wear that in a heartbeat. They christened it the Ford dress after the Model T automobile because it was affordable, it suited every figure, and it could take the wearer anywhere she wanted to go. It was made of pleated wool jersey. Now, before Chanel popularized black, it was the color of mourning. She made it chic. And she also pioneered the garçon style, borrowing design elements and silhouettes from menswear with tailoring details from riding habits and service uniforms. And her quest was to reduce and refine women's clothing to its simplest and most elegant form. So in the truest sense of the word, Chanel was a modernist. But to me, what made Chanel's work evolutionary was not just her impeccable eye and her clever innovation, it was her constant ability to reinvent herself. Her shop in Paris closed during World War II, and after the war, there was a lot of controversy that she had colluded with the Nazis, but she came back in a big way with the heyday of her popularity peaking in the 1960s with her iconic ladylike suits. And today, even without Mademoiselle Coco, the line is still a major trendsetter around the world. Here is a novel about Chanel in Paris in World War II by my friend Pamela Bennings-Yu, and it's wonderful. It's about Chanel collaborating with the Nazis. And then on the left is one by Jean Mackin, a wonderful, wonderful novel based on the rivalry between Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli. And I'll talk about her in just a minute. Now, at the same time Chanel and Poivre were building their empires, there was another rising star in Paris in the form of Jean Laveau. She began as a milliner in 1889, and later, inspired by her daughter, Marguerite, she began to design lavish dresses for little girls. And on the left, you see Laveau with her daughter at a fancy dress ball. And this photo, this iconic photo, would be transformed later into the Laveau logo. And it was Laveau's children wear that would really get her noticed. She made mother-daughter ensembles that just flew off the shelves. And at the end of World War I, the fashion world was in an upheaval. There was a sort of a revival of romantic pre-war fashion for evening dress, but there was no going back to the corset. So Laveau's very feminine robe de style came to define this era. It didn't have you didn't wear a corset, but what you wore were these things called panniers. If you see the photograph in the middle, they're like baskets, almost like a hoop skirt, but a basket, and it was worn on a waistband around your hips. But you can see it did give a pretty feminine silhouette. The style was suited to the nostalgia for the past that was felt by this very war-weary population. And once they got rid of fabric rationing, people could use more yardage in their clothing. Yet the relative simplicity of this design was refreshing, and her dresses appealed to and flattered women of all ages. This robe de style features her trademark use of intricate trimmings and floral embroideries. And here is Lady Rose from Downton Abbey on the left, wearing a beautiful robe de style. I don't know what season that is. So color, as you can see, was very important to Laveau, and she maintained her own dye works so she could control the colors of her fabrics completely. This is her apartment in 1925, and I've seen it. Entire rooms of it are on display in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which is part of the Louvre in Paris. And she was a brilliant marketer. Her department store marketing strategy in the 1920s saw the expansion of her house into bridal wear and furs and lingerie and menswear and sportswear and household goods and perfume. And that really made Laveau a pioneer in what we now think of as a lifestyle brand. She was the first one to do it. She created a fashion house with the potential for longevity. And today it's the oldest established couture house still in operation. Now, we're at the halfway point, so I can have a glass of wine. I mean, a sip. Slip there. Now we're moving into the 1930s, and I'm going to tell you about Madeleine Vionnet. Vionnet was not as universally well known as Coco Chanel, but in her time, she was just as influential. Madeleine insisted she was not a designer. She was an architect among dressmakers. She called herself a technician. And you can see here, she draped her styles on a mannequin that was half the size to scale of a human being. She's most known for using lightweight fabrics to create fluid, flattering dresses that integrated comfort and movement, and they looked fabulous on the female form. She's best known for her innovative use of the bias cut, which is a technique of cutting on the diagonal grain of the fabric. Previously, everybody knew about cutting on the bias. It makes fabric more floaty and stretchy and drapey, but it was used only for shaping collars and ruffles. Vionnet used it first for garments to create a sinuous and clingy silhouette. She had fabric custom woven at more than twice the normal width so that her dresses didn't have to have seams or a lot of seams. And she used weighted silk satins where the fabric was soaked in a metallic solution so that it added weight and drape on the body. In today's world, with all of our stretch fabrics and synthetic fabrics, it's easy to overlook how revolutionary it must have been to wear something that draped your body the way Vionet's dresses did, especially after the boxy loose fashions of the 1920s. So Vionet's style was widely adapted by the fashion world in the 1930s, and it continues to define that decade. Her fashions have a timeless elegance, and they're intricately detailed and brilliantly designed. And sometimes her clients would need help to get into them because the construction was so original. So it's not surprising that she made dresses for Isadora Duncan, the very popular at that time avant-garde modern dancer. V&A was a perfectionist. She draped her samples on these miniature dolls. She conceived her ideas in 3 dimensions instead of sketching them. Her aim was to make comfortable clothes that fell freely from the body, using the shoulders and the waistline as natural anchoring points. And for example, this dress, the bodice is suspended by embroidered crossover straps, and the skirt falls from the gathered waist. So a lot of different sized women could have worn that dress. The straps are jeweled with aquamarine and glass stones set in metal mounts, which is another V&A innovation, combining jewelry and fabric into a single design. V&A was synonymous with 1930s film star glamour, as we see in this dress worn by Jean Harlow. And for an American film audience in the throes of the Great Depression, this glamorous, sleek look was an escape from the drudgery of mending and making do. She also dressed Greta Garbo, Katharine Hepburn, Joan Crawford, and Marlene Dietrich. So V&A's influence is ongoing, and we can see that in this 1990s gown on the right by Azzedine Alaïa. That was actually the model Elle Macpherson's wedding dress. So V&A invented the bodycon dress way before Alaïa did. This one here in Panne velvet was based on the veins of a leaf. So at the top of her empire, V&A employed over 1,000 staff and 26 ateliers. In 1932, she acquired a 5-story building in Paris. But what really impressed me about her was that the House of V&A provided a clinic equipped with doctors and dentists and a gymnasium for her employees, as well as policies for maternity leave and paid holidays and daycare. Now, sadly, Madame V&A had to close her couture house at the start of World War II, and it never reopened. But she lived to be 99, and she died in 1975. Another contemporary of Chanel's was the Italian designer Elsa Schiaparelli. In the late 30s, Elsa designed clothes in collaboration with the Surrealist artists, most notably Salvador Dali. And there's Salvador and Elsa hanging out on the right. So in the heyday of Surrealism, shock value and expressionism were key. So like Poivre before her, Schiaparelli viewed clothing as a means of artistic expression. She used a lot of trompe-l'oeil effects, and this trompe-l'oeil designed sweater was one of the first things to get her on the map. Here are some designs she did in collaboration with Jean Cocteau. And here are some of her most artistic and notable designs. She designed culottes, invented culottes for a Wimbledon competitor in 1931. In her 1937 collaboration with Salvador Dali, she designed the lobster dress. And here it is worn by Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. And in the middle is Dali's lobster phone. So Wallis could pick up the phone and say, hey, Salvador, the dress fits fine. Thanks very much. Here is one called the tear dress. It's printed, it's trompe-l'oeil, it's printed, it has these savage looking rips. And then those are also interpreted on the shawl in 3D. And it reflected this pre-World War II tension, the feeling in Europe. And here is my very personal favorite, which reminds me of some of Alexander McQueen's later designs. This is the sculptural skeleton dress from 1938. And on the right, you can see the Dali sketch that inspired this design. And only this one prototype was ever made. Very Morticia Addams. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a second to insert an innovation. If you will, stop for a minute. But first you have to pretend like you have on real clothes, not yoga pants and a sweatshirt. So imagine if you did have on real clothes and you were out somewhere and you had a tote bag, etc. How many zippers do you think you might have on your person with the stuff you're carrying and maybe your shoes and everything? Well, 100 years ago, probably none of us would have had a single zipper. Elias Howe, who invented the sewing machine, also invented a rudimentary zipper in 1851, but it would take 50 more years and several redesigns before it could be manufactured reliably and affordably. The zipper first gained use in World War I for closing soldiers' galoshes and tobacco pouches, so to keep out moisture. And then after the war, it was first used in children's clothes, in the way we use Velcro now for kids' shoes to help them learn to dress themselves. But in 1937, zippers began to replace buttons on men's trouser flies for the first time. And that same year, Elsa Schiaparelli began to use zippers in her couture gowns. And this was a little risque, easy in, easy out. So while many of Schiaparelli's clothes were radical and artistic, she was also a great champion of women exhibiting a personal style. In 1934, she made the cover of Time magazine. She was the first female fashion designer to ever earn the honor. She invented the color we call shocking pink, and she designed the bottle for her perfume, which she called Shocking, after a dress form modeled after Mae West's torso on the left. A similar concept was used again later in the 1980s by Jean-Paul Gaultier, and also more recently and more literally by that great fashion innovator, Kim Kardashian. So in the early 1940s, of course, the World War happened. Women made a great positive impact on the war effort, and with rationing and women working, clothing was really about functionality and skimpy rationed yardages. But this would all change, and we're going to move right along to post-World War II, Paris. Suddenly, cloth rationing was no more. Workers came back from war and went back to work in the fashion ateliers of Paris. And in 1947, Christian Dior debuted the new look, heralding the return of women to the hearth when their men came home from the war. So just as Laveau had done after World War I, Dior seemed to intuit that this new, very feminine silhouette, which used lavish yardage and these wide and flattering skirts, was just what the public wanted. This was excess. It was pretty for pretty's sake, and it defined a new, hopeful, lighthearted style. On the left, you see the iconic bar ensemble. And if you watched Outlander, you might remember how cleverly the costume designer interpreted this silhouette, brilliantly bringing Claire's 1940s sensibility into play in an 18th century setting. The new look was a smash. Here is Princess Margaret wearing Dior, and the next year, American women wanted the same look over here. This is a photo of my mom modeling in 1948. Dior even got women back into corsets, and they were built, oftentimes they were built into the dresses, actually. And with the development at the same time of nylon and elastics and new fasteners and production machinery, there was a lot of innovation in foundation garments, as you can imagine. And one style, though, did not last very long, thank God. What we now call the bullet bra warrants no further discussion, but I would love to give a lecture just on underwear. Okay, so I hope you're still with me as we enter into the 1950s. If you have denim shirts or wrap dresses or cotton sundresses or ballet flats in your closet, you probably should thank Claire McCardell. As the mother of American style and ready-to-wear fashion, she defined an era when the US was wrestling to find its own fashion identity. According to Smithsonian Magazine, McArdle's collections through the Great Depression and World War II reflected not only the needs of the time, but of the changing social position of women who were moving from the home to the workplace and to male-dominated colleges. She offered women clothes that mirrored their new attitudes, defining a new vision of practical, energetic femininity. Dior's new look wasn't for everyone, and it wasn't affordable for everyone. And this is where McArdle stepped in. She gave women the option to reject expensive, high-maintenance French fashion. More impressive still, her pieces were affordable for everyone. Her popover dress sold in the thousands for $6.95 at a time when designer dresses by Norma Norell and Hattie Carnegie ran into the hundreds of dollars, and that's in America. So as you can see, she used a lot of buttons and gathers, and everything looked good on every kind of figure. But unfortunately, we don't hear a lot about Claire McArdle anymore, but we should, because her simple silhouettes and her frugal use of fabrics, particularly during World War II, helped shape the democratic and casual sensibility that we associate with American ready-to-wear even today. Her influence was so great that in 1950, President Truman presented her with the Women's National Press Club Award, and she went on to win many design awards. She worked on the principle that style and comfort were not mutually exclusive, much like Chanel, but this is a much more affordable. She used wash and wear fabrics. She designed clothes that worked on every body shape. She used integral pleats, ties, wraps, and sashes. And a lot of her innovations have been with us so long that it's hard to tell which is current and which is 70 years old. Now, another American designer, and one whom history doesn't remember as much as it should, is Anne Lowe. She's pictured here in one of her signature stylish hats. The New Yorker last week ran a wonderful biographical story on her. So she was the first African-American to have her own fashion label, and she made a name for herself by creating one-of-a-kind gowns for high society debutantes and matrons and brides with names like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. Her workmanship was exquisite and her designs were beautiful. And despite segregation and racism, Lowe was very selective about who she would work for. She was born in 1889 in Alabama. She was the granddaughter of an enslaved woman and a plantation owner. Her mother was a seamstress for Birmingham's high society, and Anne grew up with a passion for fine sewing and design. She used scraps from her mother's workroom and taught herself to sew the exquisite fabric flowers that became one of her signature design elements. Her mother died when she was 16. She took over the business. She used up her savings. She went to New York to design school. The school was segregated. Lowe was required to audit classes in a separate room, but the teacher still used her examples to the whole class as beautiful work. And then she settled in New York and set up her own label. First, she started doing dresses for Henry Bendel and Saks Fifth Avenue for some department stores. Now, in 1953, Lowe got what should have been her really big break when she designed Jacqueline Bouvier's wedding dress for her marriage to John F. Kennedy. This voluminous off-the-shoulder gown was constructed from 50 yards of ivory silk taffeta, and it took 8 weeks to complete. Jackie wanted to wear something by a French designer, but her father-in-law-to-be, Joe Kennedy, was paying for the wedding, and he insisted she wear an American designer. So Anne Lowe was called in. She made all the bridesmaids' dresses. And then 10 days before the wedding ceremony, a water line broke in Lowe's New York studio, and it ruined the wedding gown and all 10 of the bridesmaids' dresses. Working day and night, Lowe and her staff recreated the dresses in 5 days. She never told the family, and she lost money on the order. And sadly, Lowe didn't get the credit she deserved at the time. She was only mentioned by name in the Washington Post, where the fashion editor simply wrote, "The dress was designed by a Negro, Anne Lowe." Financial setbacks and health issues plagued her later career, and Lowe became partially blind. Her amazing work lives on in the permanent archives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian. So that brings us to the 1960s. Mary Quant was a British designer born in 1930 when Madeleine Vianney was at her peak. Quant was a major player in the mod fashion movement, and she is widely credited with inventing the miniskirt and hot pants, which might never have happened except for the introduction of nylon pantyhose in 1959. She had her hair cut by Vidal Sassoon. She was very, very groovy. She ran a trendy boutique in London, and she saw young women interpreting the Paris couture trend of shorter skirts and turn it into streetwear. She used modern innovations and synthetic fabrics brilliantly. And her mini skirts and her hot pants and colored tights and space age go-go boots were fun. And like bloomers 100 years earlier, they became a tangible symbol of growing liberation and revolution in women's fashion. Her looks were accessible and affordable to young working women. They were sold in Sears, and there were sewing patterns made by Butterick. But just like with bloomers, not everyone was on board with this radical new look. The miniskirt was a rebellion, and it was a surefire way to tick off parents or authority. But Quant got through all that. She was very, very popular. And in 2009, a British postage stamp commemorated her work. And in 2019, a retrospective of her work opened in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So one designer to go, and it's still the 1960s. Back in Paris, at the age of 18, Yves Saint Laurent arrived in Paris after finishing college. A year later, in 1955, he was hired by Christian Dior, one of the biggest 3 designers in the world at that time. Dior died from a heart attack in 1957, and Saint Laurent became the head of the House of Dior at the age of 21. He was the youngest head of a couture house ever. This is a picture of him at the age of 21, the day before his first collection launched. Now, he was just settling in, and in 1960, he was drafted by his home country of Algeria. And during his absence from Dior, he was fired and replaced. And a year later, when he came back from the war, he started YSL, Yves Saint Laurent, with his partner, Pierre Berge. Now, his designs for Dior were feminine and flattering, but Yves found his true voice in his solo collections. And this is where he changed fashion. In 1966, his collection featured a pop art line with trompe-l'oeil effects that remind me of Schiaparelli, but what really turned heads that year and had a lasting impact were his pantsuits. In 1966, even probably in 1970 in New York, a woman could not go into a nice restaurant in New York in a pantsuit. She just wouldn't be allowed in. He introduced the women's tuxedo first, which had the sensibility of a man's dinner suit, but it was cut to flatter the female form. A year after the tuxedo, the pantsuit. And we've been wearing them ever since, right? So here he is in 1970 with his 2 longtime muses. And one is Betty Catrou on the left. He considered her his female alter ego. And you can see they almost look like brother and sister. And the other one is Lulu de la Falaise. And that brings us to the end. And since I'm ending in 1970, here is Saint Laurent's safari-inspired collection for that year. That's the model Verushka. And you can see that it is a far cry from the very ladylike dresses he did for Dior just 8 years previous to that. So the next time you zip up your stretch jeans or put on a short skirt with tights. I hope you'll think about how each of the innovations and designers I've talked about today has changed fashion. And not just with a raised or lowered hemline, they changed the way women dressed. And I'll end as I began with a protest. This one is from 1966 from London, from the British Society for the Protection of the Miniskirt. And I'd love it if you'd follow me on social media and have a look at my website where I posted, as I said, a detailed reading list that goes with this talk with historical novels and with some of the research books I used. And if you know of any historical novels about these designers or these time periods, put them in the chat and I will add them to my list. Yeah, and I'd love it if you'd follow me on social media too. So I'm going to stop now, stop sharing, and go back to Nola. Hey, you're there. Can you see me?
Hi, I am, and I can see you.
Good.
So this was amazing. What a wonderful look at how women's fashion has changed and what caused that change to happen. This is absolutely amazing. Eileen Donovan, this will be posted. So once the live show ends, you will be able to go back and see what you missed at the beginning. So this will live on the Right Review so that you can take a look at that. It's also just because we like to kind of archive things, any special events that we do are on the Nola Nash Entertainment YouTube channel as well. So if you've got friends that want to see it, that's a great way to share the link for Liza's pleasant presentation is from there. So you will be able to do that as well once this live broadcast does end. Annie was trying to hurry up and get ready really quickly because she wanted to come on and talk to you for just a minute too. If you guys have any questions that you want to put in the chat to ask Liza about anything, we've had some great comments and compliments. Annie did post the link to your website so that folks could get to that reading list.
Wonderful.
Let's see, Annie, I'm not seeing you, girl. Where is Annie? She said she was here.
So I'm working on a new lecture now for the next Historical Novel Society conference in June. It's going to unfortunately be virtual, but it's going to be great, even though it's virtual. And that is going to be called Fashion Shakes Up Society, 12 Scandalous Women and What They Wore. So for anyone who's interested in historical fiction, it's a great conference. They have some really good speakers and workshops and things like that.
Okay, hang on. Annie is here, but Annie, check in the it's the Liza's Fashion Show chat is where that link is so that you can join us. So she's coming in. She's here. For some reason, I can't type Liza today. It's coming out all kinds of weird words.
Oh, yeah, I'm used to that.
Let's see if she can find. I know we've got so many chats going, and finding that link is going to be tricky. Let's see if I can share it from there. Here we go. There we go. I sent it to her. That should be easier.
Good.
So she can get in.
Good. There's another book, too, that I didn't put in my list yet. I haven't seen it. It's called The Chanel Sisters. I think it came out very recently. So that's one I'll probably add to my list. The Queen of Paris by Pamela Bennings-Ewan is really good. And what's interesting about it is Pam doesn't portray Chanel as, she shows us that Chanel was not really a really nice person. And so that to me is what really makes that book interesting. Plus she talks about the fashion and everything.
We've got lots of folks talking about their favorite parts of your talk here, the bikes, and that bikes mean independence and freedom as a favorite reason to change fashion. So that's pretty awesome. Rena wanted to know, what's your favorite designer or design era?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, it used to. Hey, Annie.
Hello.
It used to be Ralph Lauren, and that was where I wanted to work, and I got that job, so that was great. But right now, my favorite designer is Jacques Fath. He died at the age of 47 from leukemia. I'm sorry, the age of 42, and I'm writing about him in my third novel.
Oh,
great question. Thank you.
Very good question.
Annie, I'm so happy to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to jump on because I know Nola has things to do between shows.
I'm okay for now.
Okay, good. I didn't see the question. Everyone was loving the show. It's so wonderful, everything you were showing. And I was even in shock the difference between corsets in 18th century to 19th century. And so now I realize I'm going to prefer 19th century. Like when people say, when you go back in time, where would you rather live? I'm going to say 19th century. I used to say 18th, not anymore.
Yeah.
I wasn't seeing the chat either. Dressed.
I had to click on comments to see the chat. But now I'm able to see, gosh, all these nice comments. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, everybody was truly, truly enjoying everything and totally fascinated by, the different garbs that all of the women got to wear, and you talking about, what changed the circumference of clothing for women. I'm sorry, I don't feel very well, but I had to come on and say hello.
I wanted you to. I'm so glad you did.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You froze for a second there, but it's a wonderful smile. That never happens to me when I freeze. I always have to make a stupid face.
Oh, my eyes are half closed.
I'm sorry.
So you froze with a beautiful smile.
I have to see.
Well, I'm glad to see you, Annie, and I so appreciate you making this opportunity for me to come on.
The way you infused books with the clothing and everything was fascinating. So I just wanted to come on and say thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
With my...
Yeah, you're cutting out.
Anyway, so thank you. I'm going to let you go. I think it's my internet that's doing this. I have to come on again. All right.
You might want to reboot.
Have a wonderful night, and thank you so much, Liza. I hope you'll come back because I know
I'd love to.
I know you have other parts to this, right? Like a part 2, and
I'm working on that.
All right. Thank you so much, and happy
Thank you.
Women's Month. Bye.
Bye, Annie. Thank you.
Bye.
Well, everybody's had such great things to say, and I hope you get a chance to go back through and look at all of the comments because they were definitely positive. Everyone was so interested in this presentation. I was too. I'm just sitting here like glued, like, what are we talking about? So I've never been a big fashionista. Anybody who knows me know that I love my t-shirt and yoga pants. I'm all about the comfy clothes too. But absolutely fascinating. And
well, thank you.
Because I write historical fiction.
You can sweep the Jeopardy category now.
Yes, absolutely. So I have to play Jeopardy. But one of the things that I enjoy about it too is as a historical fiction writer, I always have to research clothes, and getting to know the fashion of any particular era is always part of making sure that those characters are authentic. And
yes.
you gotta get the clothes right. And so what a great presentation to kind of see how that evolved over time. Typically we're researching one particular era, whatever that era is that we're writing, but the evolution of it, kind of seeing it play out is a very interesting topic. So
thank you.
And you said your favorite fashion era. So not just designer.
Oh, yes.
Era.
Somebody asked. I would say maybe the 20s. I love the innovation of the 1920s. I love the freedom of it. I also love that period of literature. So maybe that goes along with it. But yeah, I would say the 20s.
The 20s. There we go. Well, if anybody else has any questions or comments, and if you're watching the show after the fact, after the live event, then go ahead and leave those comments down below. Make sure that you tag Liza as you're posting that comment so that she knows that comment is there, and hopefully that will get her a notification so she can go back and answer any questions that you may have. And thank you so much for joining us here on The Right Review. What a great presentation. This was a really fascinating hour, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Nola.
much,
Thanks for
Liza.
having me. And thanks to
All
Annie.
right. You are very welcome. And this was wonderful. We hope to do it again. So have a great night. And folks, Annie will be coming up with our memoir show, and I will be on later with the second line. So you've got an evening of Annie and Nola coming up tonight.
Yay.
So we hope you'll keep tuned in here and join us all evening long. We shall see you soon.
Okay,
Bye,
thanks.
guys.